Europe spent the last decade chasing an energy revolution, wind farms on the horizon, solar panels across fields, speeches about a cleaner future. And yet here's the paradox nobody wants to say out loud, after trillions in promises and hundreds of billions in spending. Electricity is still expensive, factories are still nervous, and energy security still sounds like a prayer to the weather. Now zoom in on the map and you'll see something even more uncomfortable. Right in the middle of this chaos sits a country that isn't the windiest, isn't the sunniest, and doesn't have some magical new technology. But its power is steadier. Its prices are lower. And while others hunt for gas contracts and pray for breezes, this country is quietly selling electricity to its neighbors, making money from their instability. That country is France. For years, France was mocked as Europe's aging nuclear holdout, old reactors, expensive maintenance, a system people swore was doomed. Germany, meanwhile, was celebrated as the green blueprint of the future. But history has a dark sense of humor. Today, some of the cleanest economies in Europe stay stable only when French electrons cross the border. So how did a choice made nearly 50 years ago become France's unfair advantage today? And why are countries that bet everything on renewables now staring at France's old-world technology with envy? This isn't just an energy story. It's a story about long-term strategy, about who planned for physics, and who planned for politics. In the energy debate, opinions are cheap. The scoreboard isn't. By 2024, France didn't just keep the lights on. It turned into the power broker of Europe's grid. Official data from France's transmission operator showed something that made the whole continent pause. France exported a net total of about 89 terawatt-hours of electricity. That's not a rounding error. That's the kind of volume that can cover the annual needs of an entire mid-sized country. And the money followed the electrons, roughly €5 billion in record net revenue from exporting power to neighbors who couldn't produce enough when they needed it most. This is the part that stings, because it flips the narrative. For years, France was framed as the weak link, aging reactors, maintenance backlogs, scary headlines about corrosion and shutdowns. People predicted blackouts in Paris. Meanwhile, Germany was treated like the lighthouse of the future, wind and solar, the moral high ground, the model everyone should copy. But in 2024, while France was shipping massive amounts of stable power across borders, Germany was finishing the shutdown of its last nuclear plants. And Europe learned a brutal lesson: you don't measure an energy system by how inspiring it looks on a policy slide. You measure it on the worst days, when the wind is weak, the sun disappears early, demand spikes. And the grid needs something boring and reliable to keep the whole machine from shaking apart. That's when the phone rings. And more often than people want to admit, it rings in Paris. France's advantage wasn't a miracle. It was simple. The country had a giant base of steady generation sitting there, day and night, like a heartbeat. When others had gaps, France had surplus. And surplus, in an interconnected Europe, becomes leverage, economic, industrial, and quietly political. Germany's energy transition looks impressive from 30,000 feet. Fields of solar panels. Hills lined with wind turbines. Headlines about record renewable capacity. And to be fair, Germany did build fast. It created jobs, pushed technology forward, and proved that a modern economy can deploy wind and solar at scale. But the grid doesn't run on headlines. It runs on balance. Every second, supply has to match demand. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the more you rely on weather, the more you need a backup that doesn't care about the weather. So what happens when the wind drops across northern Europe at the same time winter demand climbs? Or when a cloudy, still week stretches on longer than forecasts promised? Germany doesn't fail, but it gets squeezed, because the system suddenly needs firm power, right now, not in theory. That's where the hidden dependency shows up. In those tight moments, electricity flows across borders like water finding the lowest point. And one of the strongest currents comes from the west, French power moving into Germany and into other neighbors who are short on supply. It's not charity. It's physics plus a market. France has steady generation that can run through the night, through storms, through calm skies. So when the renewable heavy system hits a weather gap, it leans on something older, something less fashionable. And frankly something it spent years criticizing. This is the irony: Germany spent vast sums building a greener system, but on the days that matter most. Stability often arrives wearing a French label. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Energy independence starts sounding different when your price spikes are cushioned by imported electrons. Green leadership looks different when your grid safety net is a neighbor's nuclear fleet. The dependency isn't always visible in political speeches, because it's not a moral argument. It's a system constraint. France didn't win because Germany is incompetent. France won because it kept a firm foundation under the whole structure. Germany built the roof first. France kept the basement. And when the weather turns, everyone suddenly remembers what the basement is for. Energy isn't just a climate story. It's a cost story. And cost is a weapon. If you're a household in France, the state has long treated electricity like essential infrastructure, not a luxury commodity. Prices are managed, smoothed, and politically protected. The result is simple: French families often pay something like 17 to 20 euro cents per kilowatt-hour. Cross the border into Germany and you can see a very different reality: 30 to 40 euro cents per kilowatt-hour is common. That gap doesn't look like much on paper until you multiply it by every heater, every stove, every factory motor, every hour of the year. Now scale that up to industry, where electricity isn't a bill, it's oxygen. If you run an aluminum smelter, a chemical plant, a steel facility, or anything tied to hydrogen, your profit margin can be decided by the price of power. Volatility becomes poison. You can't plan. You can't sign long contracts. You can't invest confidently. And when you can't predict your input costs, you do what businesses always do: you look for a new zip code. This is how energy prices quietly rearrange the map of manufacturing. Germany's industrial heartland, built on reliable, affordable energy, has started feeling the pressure. Not because Germans forgot how to build machines, but because the energy math changed. When power gets expensive and unpredictable, even world-class factories start asking dangerous questions: should we expand somewhere else? Should we shift production to the US, where gas is cheap? Should we follow supply chains toward China? France has been using the opposite message like a magnet: come here. We can offer stable power. We can offer long-term contracts. We can offer low-carbon electricity that doesn't spike every time the wind slows down. That's why this isn't just about comfort at home. It's about whether a continent keeps making things, or becomes a continent that imports them. And in that contest, electricity is not a background detail. It's the entry fee to stay industrial. France understood that early. Germany learned it the hard way. There's another scorecard Europe can't ignore: carbon. For years, the argument sounded straightforward: renewables equal clean, nuclear equals complicated. But the grid doesn't grade you on intentions. It grades you on what you actually burn when the system is stressed. In France, the carbon intensity of electricity is often astonishingly low, roughly in the range of a few dozen grams of CO2 per kilowatt-hour. That's what happens when a large share of your power comes from reactors that run steadily, day and night, without emitting carbon at the point of generation. Germany's story is more complicated. On sunny, windy days, the grid can look impressively green. But when the weather flips, when wind fades and solar drops early, Germany has to fill the gap fast. And the fastest gap fillers are often fossil plants. Especially coal. That's when emissions can spike dramatically, turning the same system that looked clean yesterday into something much dirtier today. This is the uncomfortable difference between clean on paper and clean in real time. Germany didn't do everything wrong. It built renewables at a pace most countries couldn't match. It created an entire industrial ecosystem around them. The problem is timing: building weather-dependent generation faster than you build the supporting pillars, transmission lines, large-scale storage. Dispatchable low-carbon backup creates a fragile system. A system that behaves beautifully in ideal conditions, and violently when conditions aren't ideal. France's advantage is boring, and that's the point. A stable low-carbon backbone makes your emissions profile resilient. You don't have to get lucky with the weather to stay clean. And when energy becomes a competition between economies, that resilience stops being a technical detail. It becomes a strategic edge. To understand why France is sitting in a stronger position today, you have to rewind to a moment when the country felt weak, almost helpless. It's 1973. The Yom Kippur War erupts. Oil becomes a weapon. And suddenly, the modern world learns a terrifying lesson: if someone else controls your fuel, they can control your economy. Prices explode. Supplies tighten. Governments panic. For France, the shock hits harder than most people realize. In the early 1970s, France wasn't just using oil for cars and heating, much of its electricity was tied to burning oil too. And unlike Germany, France didn't have deep domestic coal. Unlike the US or the Netherlands, it didn't have a comfortable cushion of gas. France looked at the map and saw an ugly truth: it had very little energy in its own hands. That vulnerability wasn't just economic. It felt like a national security nightmare. If oil flows stopped, the country could freeze, factories could shut down, transport could stall. A modern state can't function without energy. And in that moment, France decided it would never be held hostage again. Enter Pierre Messmer, the Prime Minister. He wasn't a politician known for slow compromise. He came out of a hard tradition: state authority, strategy, discipline. Watching France depend on decisions made in faraway capitals, he reached a conclusion that would define a generation. France needed energy sovereignty, and it needed it fast. On March 6, 1974, the French government announced a new energy strategy, later known as the Messmer Plan. The core idea was almost shockingly blunt: France didn't have oil, but it had engineers. So it would build a national electric system anchored by nuclear power. Not as a small experiment. Not as a symbolic gesture. As a full-scale national pivot. Think about what that meant in the 1970s. Nuclear was powerful, yes, but expensive, politically sensitive, technically demanding. And France wasn't proposing 1 or 2 reactors. It was proposing an industrial sprint. A bet that the country would standardize, build, and operate a fleet large enough to transform the grid. The decision came with surprisingly little of the long, public, procedural debate we associate with modern infrastructure. No decade-long environmental hearings. No endless approvals. The state chose a direction and moved the machine. It was a gamble, huge, concentrated, and risky. But it was also driven by one clear logic: in a world where energy can be used against you, independence isn't a slogan. It's concrete, steel, and megawatts. Here's the part people miss: France didn't treat nuclear like a collection of one-off megaprojects. It treated it like manufacturing. In the United States, nuclear plants often became custom-built monuments: different designs, different contractors. Different rules from state to state. That flexibility sounds nice until you try to control costs, train operators, stock spare parts, and maintain safety across dozens of sites. Customization turns every project into a new problem. France did the opposite. It chose a core reactor model and then repeated it, again and again, like an assembly line for reliability. Control rooms followed the same logic. Components were built to the same standards. Training manuals matched across the fleet. A valve that fit one site could fit another. A technician trained in one plant could work in the next without relearning the entire system. That's not just efficiency. That's resilience. Standardization turns an energy system into a network rather than a set of islands. When something breaks, you don't start from scratch, you swap, repair, and move. Maintenance becomes predictable. Safety protocols become consistent. Supply chains become real, not theoretical. And most importantly, the country accumulates experience, thousands of small lessons that compound into a national capability. Over time, that capability became France's hidden asset. By the 1990s, the transformation was basically complete. France had shifted from a nation exposed to imported oil shocks into one of Europe's most electricity-secure countries. The lights in small villages, the factories in industrial regions. The trains moving across the country, much of it powered by a steady nuclear backbone built by engineers decades earlier. This is why France could later absorb shocks that would rattle others. Not because nuclear is magically easy. It isn't. But because France built an operating culture around it, technical, standardized, and system-wide. And once you build a capability like that, it becomes like a fortress wall. You don't notice it on calm days. You notice it when the storm hits. And then, in 2022, the storm hit France. The timing was almost cruel. Russia's war in Ukraine turned natural gas into a geopolitical weapon. Europe panicked. Prices surged. Governments scrambled. And right in the middle of that chaos, France's nuclear machine, Europe's supposed battery, suddenly showed a terrifying weakness. Not an accident. Not a meltdown. Something quieter. Something engineers dread because it doesn't announce itself with explosions. It announces itself with hairline cracks. During routine inspections, technicians discovered microscopic fractures in critical piping, part of safety systems designed to cool reactors in extreme scenarios. The culprit was stress corrosion cracking, the kind of slow, sneaky damage that can grow under the surface. In most industries, you might monitor it, schedule a repair, move on. In nuclear, you don't negotiate with risk. If there's a question mark, you stop. And once France looked closer, it realized the problem wasn't isolated. It was systematic. Certain reactor models were more exposed. Suddenly, one shutdown became many. Within months, the country was pulling reactors offline one after another, not because they were failing, but because France refused to let them fail. At the peak of the crisis, around 32 of France's 56 reactors were offline. Think about what that meant. France, long the exporter, was now forced to import electricity to keep the grid stable. It bought power from neighbors, including Germany, sometimes during periods when German electricity was being produced with coal. The symbolism was brutal. Wholesale prices spiked to levels that felt surreal. Spot market electricity in France surged to extreme highs compared to normal conditions. And the political pressure was immediate. Critics called it proof that nuclear was a dinosaur, old, fragile, too complex to maintain. The narrative people had waited years to deliver was suddenly back on the table. We told you so. The grid operator issued warnings and asked citizens to reduce consumption during peak hours. The word blackout floated through headlines again. Paris in the dark became a media fantasy. This was France's darkest energy moment in decades, not because the reactors were unsafe, but because the system had been built so heavily around them that any fleet-wide issue could shake the entire country. And yet, this is where the story turns. Because France didn't respond the way many expected. It didn't panic and abandon the foundation. It treated it like an emergency engineering problem, something to be fixed, not something to be surrendered. France's response to the 2022 crisis wasn't political theater. It was mobilization. EDF and the broader French nuclear system went into what looked like a wartime repair campaign. Specialized welding teams, top-tier professionals trained for high-precision work, were deployed across sites. In nuclear facilities, you don't just patch things. You inspect, isolate, replace, and certify. It's slow by nature, because the margin for error is zero. France accelerated anyway, by throwing skill, coordination, and resources at the problem. This effort sits inside a larger program often described as a comprehensive overhaul, major maintenance, upgrades, life extension work. The unglamorous engineering that keeps a complex machine alive. To outsiders, it looks like bureaucracy and cost. In reality, it's the price of keeping a high-performance system reliable for decades. And it worked. By the winter of 2023, reactors were coming back online one by one. The grid stabilized. The fear of rolling blackouts faded. France didn't just restore capacity, it restored confidence that the problem could be identified, attacked, and solved. That matters because it highlights a deeper difference between energy systems. When a wind farm stops producing because the air is still, there's nothing you can repair. You can't send welders to fix the sky. You can only wait, import, or burn something else. But when a reactor goes offline due to a technical issue, humans can intervene. You can diagnose the failure mode. You can replace parts. You can change procedures. You can harden the system against repeat events. By 2024, France wasn't just back. It was exporting again at the highest levels in years, proof that the aging nuclear fleet wasn't a one-way decline. It was a system that could be repaired, improved, and returned to service. And as the winter of 2025 arrived, that machine was, for the most part, running steadily again, exactly when Europe needed stability the most. So the 2022 crisis didn't end France's nuclear story. In a strange way, it reinforced it. This wasn't a fragile fantasy. It was difficult infrastructure, maintenance-heavy, expensive, and brutally technical, but also recoverable. And recoverable, in an unstable world, is its own kind of power. Flamanville 3 is the name that makes nuclear supporters wince. It was supposed to be France's sleek next-gen reactor, a European pressurized reactor, safer, stronger, more efficient. Construction began in 2007 with a price tag that sounded manageable and a start date that sounded optimistic. Then reality arrived, delays stacked on delays, budgets blew out, and the project became a cautionary tale. To critics, it was proof nuclear is too slow and too expensive. But there's a deeper story inside that mess. France, and most of the West, had basically stopped building new reactors at scale for decades. Supply chains thinned. Skilled teams retired. How to build nuclear became something you remembered, not something you practiced. Flamanville wasn't just a project. It was painful retraining, the tuition you pay when you forget how to ride a bike. And once you pay that tuition, the next steps can get cheaper and faster. That's the logic behind EPR2, a simplified, standardized design meant to capture the lessons learned the hard way. France has signaled a new build wave, multiple reactors planned, often at existing nuclear sites, where grid links and local acceptance are easier than starting from zero. At the same time, France is hedging with smaller bets, SMRs, small modular reactors, built more like products than monuments. Factory fabrication, repeatable modules, quicker on-site assembly. Not a magic wand, but a way to cut one-off megaproject risk and deliver steady power, and even industrial heat, where heavy industry needs it. Then comes the next chess move, hydrogen. Germany leans on green hydrogen from wind and solar, even if that means imports. France argues, if you already have low-carbon power running day and night, why not use off-peak electricity to split water? After years of EU fights over definitions, Europe created pathways for low-carbon hydrogen, opening space for nuclear-powered production to count if it meets strict emissions rules. All of this isn't only about electrons. It's influence. A growing nuclear-friendly bloc inside Europe looks to Paris for technology, standards, and a playbook. And as AI and data centers chase huge, reliable, low-carbon power, France's message is blunt. We can deliver clean electricity that doesn't depend on tomorrow's weather. But no energy story is a fairy tale, and France's advantage comes with sharp edges. Nuclear doesn't erase dependence, it trades one kind for another. France may no longer fear a gas cutoff the way Europe did in 2022, but it still needs uranium. And France doesn't mine it at home. The last domestic mine closed decades ago, so supply flows in from abroad, countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Australia, and others. Uranium is easier to stockpile than gas, yes, but it still creates geopolitical ties you can't pretend don't exist. Then there's the problem every nuclear country inherits, waste. Some high-level waste remains dangerous for time scales that don't fit inside normal politics. France reprocesses part of its spent fuel, recovering usable material and shrinking the volume of ultimate waste, but the hardest part remains. Permanent isolation, deep underground, for generations. Projects designed for that purpose face delays, protests, and the simple reality that long-term is easy to say and hard to build. And one more bill waits at the end of the timeline, decommissioning. Every reactor eventually retires. Taking them apart safely is complex and expensive, and critics argue the true cost can land on taxpayers if reserves fall short. So the lesson isn't nuclear is perfect or renewables failed. The lesson is harsher and more useful. any serious power system has to answer three questions at the same time. Is it stable when the weather turns? Is it affordable enough to keep industry at home? And is it clean enough to last for decades? France, for now, has a head start because it planted trees 50 years ago, and today it's sitting in the shade. The real question is what each country is planting for 2076. What do you think matters most in long-term infrastructure decisions, technology, cost, or stability? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want more calm, long-horizon analysis on economics and geopolitics, hit like to support the work. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one.